This video is brought to you by Quincy 400. In the field of aviation, few figures loom larger in the popular imagination than Amelia Earhart. Over a relatively brief 10-year career, the legendary aviatrix became an icon and inspiration for women everywhere, becoming the first woman to fly the Atlantic solo and setting dozens of long-distance flight records. Her mysterious disappearance during an attempted round-the-world flight in 1937 continues to fuel speculation to this day, ensuring her legacy will live on for years to come. But before she was a world-famous superstar, Amelia Earhart was a struggling social worker and pilot living in Massachusetts whose earliest flights were instrumental in the establishment of Dennison Field, among the first commercial airports in the United States. Amelia Earhart was born on July 24, 1897 in Atchison, Kansas, the eldest of two daughters born to Amy Otis and Edwin Earhart, a lawyer. From an early age, Amelia displayed a love of adventure and the outdoors, spending long days with her younger sister Muriel, exploring the neighborhood, collecting insects, and engaging in all sorts of rough and tumble play, including building a roller coaster-like ramp that provided Amelia with a first taste of flight. But aside from a few idyllic years spent in Atchison, much of Amelia's childhood was characterized by hardship and constant movement. Quote, "There are two kinds of stones, as everyone knows, one of which rolls. Because I selected a father who was a railroad man, it has been my fortune to roll." But when Edwin Earhart's law practice failed in 1905, he took a job as a claims officer for the Rock Island Railroad and moved the family to Des Moines, Iowa. At first, all seemed well for the family, with Edwin quickly earning a promotion. But he soon began drinking heavily and quickly descended into alcoholism, forcing him to retire from his position in 1914 and seek treatment. Around this time, Amelia's wealthy grandmother died, leaving a considerable inheritance. However, this was reserved in a trust for Amelia and Muriel, forcing the Earharts to auction off the family home. Amelia would later describe this event as one of the saddest in her life and the end of her childhood. In 1915, Edwin Earhart found work with the Grand Trunk Railway and moved the family to St. Paul, Minnesota. He later accepted a transfer to Springfield, Missouri, only to find upon his arrival that the position no longer existed. Fed up with the constant moves, Amy Earhart left Edwin and took her daughters to live with friends in Chicago. Throughout this tumultuous period, young Amelia thought long and deeply about her future direction in life, keeping a scrapbook of prominent women and of male-dominated careers such as filmmaking, law, and engineering. In Chicago, she began canvassing local high schools, seeking out the best science program. Her unusual approach put off several candidates, with one school rejecting her after she compared their chemistry lab to a kitchen sink. She eventually enrolled at Hyde Park High School in 1916, but did not enjoy the experience, a yearbook caption describing her as the girl in brown who walks alone. Amelia next enrolled in junior college at Ogont School in Rydell, Pennsylvania, but never completed her program. During Christmas vacation in 1917, she traveled north to visit Muriel at a college preparatory school in Toronto, Canada. It was to prove a formative experience. In Toronto, Amelia was exposed to the sobering sight of thousands of wounded soldiers returning from the First World War, inspiring her to abandon her studies, take a first aid course, and volunteer as a nursing aide at the Spadina Military Hospital. It was also around this time that Amelia Earhart finally discovered her lifelong passion. Though she had first encountered an airplane at an Iowa State Fair in 1908, it was during her time in Toronto that her love of aviation was truly kindled. At the time, Toronto was the center of aviation in the British Empire, with dozens of military air bases and civilian flying clubs scattered around the city. During an air show at the Canadian National Exhibition in 1918, the sisters were dive-bombed by a mischievous stunt pilot, but the unflappable Amelia stood her grounds, later reminiscing, "I'm sure the pilot said to himself, 'Watch me make them scamper.' It was mid-November, with snow on the ground. The backwash of the propellers threw burning, biting snow in my face. It was like the finest cold shower you ever imagined. I did not understand it at the time, but I believe that little red airplane said something to me as it swished by. I determined then that I would someday ride one of these devil machines." Amelia served as a nurse until fall 1919, when, like millions around the globe, she contracted Spanish influenza. Her convalescence lasted nearly a year, the disease leaving her with severe sinus problems that would plague her for the rest of her life. Once recovered, Amelia enrolled in the pre-med program at Columbia University, but after only a year of studies, changed her mind and quit to join her recently reunited parents in California. Inspired by her experiences in Toronto, on December 28, 1920, Amelia traveled to Doughty Field in Long Beach and took her first airplane ride with a barnstormer and future air racing superstar Frank Hawks. The 10-minute flight would forever change her life, with Amelia later stating, "By the time I had got 200 or 300 feet off the ground, I knew I had to fly." Over the next year, Amelia worked various jobs, including photographer, truck driver, and secretary, eventually raising the $1,000 she needed for flying lessons. She took her first lesson on January 3rd, 1921 at Kinner Field, her instructor being pioneering aviatrix Anita Snook, the first woman to own her own aviation business and run a commercial airfield. Though initially skeptical, her mother eventually agreed to dip into her daughter's trust fund to help her complete her lessons, and Amelia soloed for the first time in late 1921. She wasted no time establishing herself in the aviation field. On her 25th birthday, she brought a bright yellow Kinner Airster biplane she dubbed the Canary, and on the 22nd of October 1922 used it to set a world altitude record for women of 14,000 feet over Rogers Field, Los Angeles. And on May 15th, 1923, she became the 16th woman in the United States to be issued a pilot's license by the Paris-based International Aeronautical Federation, or FAI. Being a woman in a predominantly male field presented numerous challenges, and to fit in, Amelia took to sleeping in her leather flight coat to make it look more worn and cut her hair short in the style of other female aviators. But the good times were not to last. When Amelia's parents divorced in 1924, she sold the Canary and drove her mother across the country to live with Muriel's family in Connecticut. By this time, a failed investment in a gypsum mine had all but depleted Amelia's trust fund, forcing her to settle in Boston and seek alternative employment. After completing a course in teaching English at Massachusetts University, she found work as a social worker at Dennison House, a settlement house that helped immigrants from Ireland, Syria, and China adjust to life in the US. Meanwhile, she continued to feed her passion for aviation, joining the Boston chapter of the National Aeronautic Association, writing regular newspaper columns on flying and performing promotional flights for the Kinner Aircraft Company. She quickly gained a reputation for skill and daring, the Boston Globe calling her one of the best women pilots in the United States. In 1927, Amelia invested what little spare money she had into businessman Harold Dennison's scheme to build an airfield outside the town of Quincy, Massachusetts. Completed in July of that year, Dennison Field was among the first commercial airports in the country. The site already had an impressive aviation pedigree. In 1910, it had played host to the Harvard-Boston Aeromet, the first international flight competition in the United States and the second such event held anywhere in the world. But this was not enough to guarantee the success of Dennison's venture. While modern aviation had begun in the United States with the Wright brothers pioneering flights of 1903, in the late 1920s, passenger air travel was still something of a novelty for American travelers. One of the first commercial airlines in the country, Aira Marine West Indies Airways, was founded in 1920 by Manhattan car dealer Inglis M. Uppercue. The airline flew a 1,000-mile route between Key West, Florida and Havana, Cuba, allowing prohibition-parched passengers to enjoy an endless supply of free-flowing liquor. Unfortunately, the unreliable and uncomfortable nature of early aircraft, along with a number of fatal crashes, caused the airline and many of its successors to fold, planting in the minds of the American people a deep-seated suspicion of flying. Commercial aviation on the continent was only kept alive by the government's establishment of a heavily subsidized airmail service. Harold Dennison, however, was convinced of the future of passenger air travel and sought to make Quincy the epicenter of a transport revolution. While it is commonly claimed that Amelia Earhart flew the first commercial flight out of Dennison Field, this claim has since been disputed. She did, however, save the airfield from a potential public relations disaster. To help promote his venture, in September 1927, Harold Dennison invited world-famous German stunt pilot Theodora Rasch to perform a demonstration flight over Dennison Field. During the September 28th flight, the engine on Rasch's aircraft failed, forcing her to make an emergency crash landing in a nearby swamp. While Rasch was unhurt, the incident threatened to damage the reputation of women pilots, so Amelia Earhart jumped into an aircraft and gave what the Boston Globe called an excellent demonstration of flying, thrilling the assembled crowd and securing the airfield's future. Miss Amelia, as she was known to the locals, soon became a regular presence at Dennison Field, an exotic figure known for her masculine dress style and passionate devotion to aviation, spending every spare moment logging ever more precious flying hours. But Amelia's sojourn in Quincy would last barely a year, for on April 27, 1928, she received the fateful phone call that would catapult her into superstardom. On the line was U.S. Navy Captain H.H. Rayleigh, who asked Amelia to become the first woman to cross the Atlantic by air. Amelia Earhart would be far from the first woman to make the attempt. Following Charles Lindbergh's celebrated solo crossing in May 1927, a number of intrepid women lined up to be the first to match his feat. First out of the gate was 63-year-old British aristocrat Princess Anne Lowenstein-Wertheim, the avid pilot and sportswoman. On August 31, 1927, Princess Anne, along with pilots Captain Leslie Hamilton and Colonel Frederick Minchin, took off from Upavon, Wiltshire, and headed westbound for Ottawa. Their aircraft, the Fokker F-7 St. Raphael, was spotted by a ship early the next morning, but it was never seen again, vanishing without a trace. The next to make the attempt were American pilots Ruth and George Alderman, who set off from Long Island on October the 11th, 1927, in a Stinson Detroiter dubbed American Girl. Engine trouble forced the pair to ditch the aircraft 500 kilometers short of the Azores, but they were picked up by a passing freighter and treated to a ticker-tape parade on their return to the US. Following close behind was their rival Frances Grayson, who set off from Long Island on December the 23rd, 1927, bound for Harbour Grace, Newfoundland. Grayson and her crew never reached their destination, disappearing somewhere off the coast of Nova Scotia. On March 13, 1928, British shipping heiress and actress Elsie Mackay and pilot Captain W.G.R. Hincliffe attempted a crossing from Cranwell, Lincolnshire to Long Island, but also disappeared without a trace. Of the 4 women to attempt an Atlantic crossing before Amelia Earhart, only one had survived the experience. Nor was Amelia Earhart the first choice to make the flight. In mid-1927, American-born British socialite Amy Guest decided to become the first woman to fly the Atlantic and purchased a Fokker F7 trimotor from explorer Richard E. Byrd, the first man to reach both the North and South Poles by air. She christened the aircraft Friendship and set about finding a crew to carry out the crossing. However, under intense pressure from her family, Guest decided that the crossing was too hazardous for her to attempt and agreed to give up her seat, but only if an American girl of the right image could be found to replace her. Among Guest's team of advisors was publisher and promoter George Putnam, who had already published best-selling books by Lindbergh and Byrd. One of Putnam's associates phoned Rear Admiral Reginald K. Belknap in Boston and asked if he knew any potential candidates. Belknap's response would make history. "I knew a young social worker who flies. Call Dennison House and ask for Amelia Earhart." On June 17, 1928, Amelia, along with pilots Wilma Stultz and Lewis Gordon, took off from Trepassey Harbour, Newfoundland, and headed east, landing 20 hours and 40 minutes later in Buryport, Wales. Amelia did not pilot the flight and was instead tasked with keeping the flight log. She later expressed disappointment at her passive role, lamenting to reporters, "Stultz did all the flying. He had to. I was just baggage, like a sack of potatoes. Maybe someday I'll try it alone." Nonetheless, the pioneering flight made Amelia Earhart an instant celebrity, granting her the fame and resources she needed to pursue her aviation ambitions. After marrying George Putnam in 1931, Amelia purchased a Lockheed Vega aircraft on May 20th, 1932, and became the first woman to repeat Charles Lindbergh's historic feat, making a non-stop solo flight between Harbour Grace, Newfoundland, and Carmore Island in 14 hours and 56 minutes. Many more aviation firsts soon followed, including the first solo flight from Hawaii to California, a 5th-place Bendix Transcontinental Air Race finish, and 7 women's speed and distance records. During this time, Amelia also founded the International Organization of Women Pilots. As her first call for members yielded 99 responses, Amelia dubbed the organization the 99s, the name that it still holds to this day. In 1935, Amelia set her sights on her most ambitious feat yet, a 29,000-mile circumnavigation of the globe along the equator. For this epic voyage, Amelia purchased a state-of-the-art Lockheed 10E Electra airliner and partnered with experienced navigators Fred Noonan and Captain Harry Manning. The crew set off on their first attempts on March 17, 1937, crossing the Pacific Ocean from California to Hawaii. However, 3 days later, the aircraft was severely damaged in an accident on takeoff and had to be shipped back to the mainland for repairs. On June 1st, Earhart and Noonan set off again, their route taking them from Miami through 26 stops in South America, Africa, South Asia, and Australia, reaching Lae, New Guinea on June 29th. Just after midnight on July 2nd, the pair departed for Lae, bound for Howland Island, a tiny 1.6-mile-long speck of land in the Central Pacific. They never arrived, with the Coast Guard Carter Itasca recording the aircraft's last radio transmission at 7:45 a.m. An extensive search for the aircraft turned up nothing, and Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan were officially declared dead on January 5th, 1939. In the 8 decades since her disappearance, the ultimate fate of Amelia Earhart has been hotly debated, with theorists variously speculating that she and Noonan survived for a time on a nearby desert island or were captured and executed by the Japanese. But that's a subject for another video. Back in Quincy, Dennison Field steadily grew and served as a successful commercial airport until 1942, when it was taken over by the Navy to create the Squantum Naval Air Station. The base was used through the Second World War to train Allied aircrew and patrol the eastern seaboard. However, Squantum's proximity to Boston's Logan International Airport and the short length of its runways made it unsuitable for modern jet fighter operations, and in 1953 the base was shut down and naval air operations relocated to the Weymouth Naval Air Station. Today, almost nothing remains of Dennison Field, the cradle of US commercial aviation, and Amelia Earhart's last waypoint on her journey into aviation legend. Bonus fact: The creator of Crayola crayons, among other things, Edwin and Alice Binney's daughter, Dorothy, was for a time married to publisher and promoter George P. Putnam, who would in turn have 2 children with her before the couple were divorced. So what does this have to do with our story today? Well, the ultimate cause of the divorce was in part because of a long-standing affair Dorothy had been having, but also the fact that Putnam himself had fallen in love with Amelia Earhart. The two became extremely close when Earhart came to live with Putnam while they wrote a book together chronicling her aforementioned first flight across the Atlantic. After he got divorced shortly thereafter, he would propose to Amelia Earhart 6 times before she finally accepted. As to her hesitation here, we have a letter from the legend herself, which she gave him on their wedding day. In it, Earhart wrote, "You must know, again, my reluctance to marry. I feel the move just now as foolish as anything I could do. I know there may be compensations, but have no heart to look ahead. On our life together, I want you to understand I shall not hold you to any medieval code of faithfulness to me, nor shall I consider myself bound to you similarly. If we can be honest, I think the difficulties which arise may best be avoided should you or I become interested deeply or in passing with anyone else. Please let us not interfere with the other's work or play, nor let the world see our private joys or disagreements. In this connection, I may have to keep some place where I can go to be by myself now and then, for I cannot guarantee to endure at all times the confinement of even an attractive cage. I must exact a cruel promise, and that is you will let me go in a year if we find no happiness together. I will try to do my best in every way and give you that part of me you know and seem to want." Also, extremely odd for her time, she chose not to take her husband's new name. They also didn't bother with any honeymoon or anything, both going right back to work after their weekend wedding, her back on a flight tour, and he back to his day job. It all worked out, though, once she saw her husband really did want her as she was and wasn't in the slightest bit interested in interfering with her work or her being an extremely atypical wife. She would later state a few years later, "I had no special feelings about Mr. Putnam at first. I was too absorbed in the prospects of the trip and my being the one to make it. Of course, after I had talked to him for very long, I was conscious of the brilliant mind and keen insight of the man. We came to depend on each other. Yet it was only friendship between us, or so at least I thought at first. At least I didn't admit even to myself that I was in love, but at last the time came. I don't quite know when it happened, when I couldn't deceive myself no longer. I couldn't continue telling myself that what I felt for GP was only friendship. I knew I had found the one person who could put up with me." And finally, to conclude this not-so-quick fact section, a great quote from Earhart after crossing the Atlantic solo and becoming the first person to cross by air twice. She stated, "If there is anything I have learned in life, it is this. If you follow the inner desire of your heart, the incidentals will take care of themselves. If you want badly enough to do a thing, you usually do it very well. And a thing well done, as a society is organized, usually works out to the benefit of others as well as yourself."